Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. We got a World War III alert. U.S., they just can't stop trying to get us nuked. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Salute. You know, they just want us nuked, y'all. I tell you, these small hats, I don't know. I guess it is too many people on this planet. They want depopulation and they want nuclear war. Let's get into the content.
The threat China poses is real and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. But beyond our borders and beyond our neighborhood, we are reorienting toward deterring aggression by communist China. Those who long for peace must prepare for war.
Now, why they mentioning China very recklessly, I want y'all to remember we looked at the Indian-Pakistan war. We detailed it here on Cofiga TV News Network. We're not dumb. We know that the Chinese air missiles devastated NATO plane, the French fighter jet, devastated them, knocking them out the sky, some of the most advanced jets. And Pakistan wasn't using China's most advanced missiles. They weren't using their most advanced missiles. You know, these people talking shit. China has been preparing for a war with the U.S. China is not just more advanced in their factories and things of that nature. Their military has got more advanced. We think of China, we just think about iPhones and new mega cities that look futuristic. Well, their military is also futuristic, and the U.S. is playing a very dangerous game.
And that's exactly what we're doing. Nobody knows what China will ultimately do, but they are preparing. And therefore, we must be ready as well.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense gave an extremely hawkish speech in which he repeatedly referred to China as a threat. And he said in no uncertain terms that the U.S. military is preparing for war. I'm not exaggerating. Listen to this clip here of the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
Because they're not planning to defeat China. See, they can't defeat. They haven't won a war since the 40s. It's to start wars, endless wars. They want to hurt their economy. They want to cripple their economy. They want to bait China into going into Taiwan. And when people say evade Taiwan, they can't evade Taiwan. Taiwan is China. They want to go into Taiwan militarily. They can put sanctions on them. They do want war, but they want to cripple the Chinese economy. They don't care how many Americans get killed to do it either.
The U.S. is preparing for war. Although in typical Orwellian fashion, he claims that the U.S. must prepare for war in order to achieve peace.
The motto of my first platoon, first one I led, was those who long for peace must prepare for war. And that's exactly what we're doing. We are preparing for war in order to deter war, to achieve peace through strength.
So essentially, war is peace is the message of the Trump administration's Pentagon. This has been a slogan that has been constantly repeated by Pete Hegseth. He says that Trump wants peace through strength. And he says that the U.S. empire wants to reestablish deterrence. And in the speech, Hegseth repeatedly said that Donald Trump will not hesitate to use military force if the U.S. considers it necessary.
President Trump said it himself last month in Riyadh and will never hesitate to wield American power swiftly and decisively if necessary. That is reestablishing deterrence.
And he said if deterrence fails, then he is preparing for war.
But if deterrence fails, and if called upon by my commander-in-chief, we are prepared to do what the Department of Defense does best, to fight and win decisively.
And Pete Hegseth gave this speech on the 31st of May at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is a conference that is held every year in Singapore. This brings together leaders of countries from the Asia-Pacific region.
that's the most preposterous part about all of this. Imperialist America and Asian talking about their Asian power. See, the Americans say that they're an Asian power because of Hawaii, because of Guam, because of these islands that they got in Asia. This is disgusting. Now they want to run Asians, and they show up at all of the meetings that these people have. Talk about we got to cooperate because China's threatening us in the South China Sea. This is disgusting. What the U.S. is trying to pull, talking about their Asian power.
Now, the United States is in the Western Hemisphere, very far away from Asia, and the U.S. is the leader of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. However, the U.S. claims to be a Pacific power, largely because the U.S. state of Hawaii is located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but also because
everybody should understand this, man. This is serious business. Everybody should understand this. This is why I don't like the Congressional Black Coons. This is how I know they're not serious. You can't give a damn about our history and you go along with this type of shit. You can't give a damn about what happened to us if you're trying to do that shit to other fucking people. These Europeans came into our lands and then they took our identity and say, we are you. They're doing it in Asia. They're saying they are Asians. And China, you trying to tell real Asians. You're trying to start stuff in our neighborhood. This is disgusting, bro.
The U.S. has militarized many countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including South Korea and Japan, that have been militarily occupied by the U.S. for over 70 years. In fact, the U.S. Defense Secretary joked about this in his speech. He noted that in just 4 months after the Trump administration entered office, he had already visited the Asia-Pacific region 2 different times, although he refers to it as the Indo-Pacific region, which is part of an attempt by the U.S. government to rebrand the Asia-Pacific to add in India as part of the U.S. strategy to try to ally with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and India against China. But anyway, Pete Hegseth boasted that he's going to keep coming back to this region to threaten China. And he said clearly that the U.S. is here to stay in this region on the other side of the world.
As was mentioned, I'm certainly proud to be back in the Indo-Pacific for the second time as the Secretary of Defense. And I'm going to keep coming back and back and back again. You're stuck with me. But it's not just me. America is proud to be back in the Indo-Pacific, and we're here to stay.
That was how Pete Hegseth began this very hawkish speech. And essentially the message was, in a nutshell, the U.S. is preparing for war on China, and the U.S. empire insists on maintaining its hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. empire wants to control this entire region, and he repeatedly referred to China as a threat. And he told China, you are not going to kick the U.S. empire out of this region.
A threat gathers. It requires confronting obvious truth about the threats that we face in the Indo-Pacific, and it requires meeting those threats with a very real sense of urgency. Let me begin by saying we do not seek conflict with Communist China, but we will not be pushed out of this critical region.
Now, for people who don't know, Pete Hegseth has very extreme political views, and he is an aggressive China hawk. He was formerly a host on Fox News, the right-wing TV channel, and Trump used to watch him all the time on TV and said he should run the U.S. military. And Pete Hegseth published a book in 2020 that outlined his extreme fundamentalist religious views. The book is called American Crusade, and in it, he proudly refers to himself as a crusader. He says that the U.S. empire should continue the Christian crusades that were launched 1,000 years ago. And on the first page of the book, he said that the right wing in the United States, which he proudly identifies with, is waging a holy war. He used the term holy war. And who are the targets of this holy war? He made it very clear that in the book, he said those targets are China, and he always refers to China as communist China with this kind of Cold War rhetoric. So he says communist China, the international left, and Islam. billions of Muslims around the world. Those are the main targets of this holy war led by the guy who's now overseeing the Pentagon, the US Department of Defense. The US Defense Secretary claimed that supposedly China seeks hegemony in the Asia Pacific region, which, by the way, is false. The Chinese government has constantly said it does not want hegemony. But essentially, what Pete Hegseth was trying to do is he was warning other countries in the Asia Pacific region who were attending the Shangri-La dialogue, this conference. He was telling them that the US empire wants to ally with other countries in Asia against China. And he claimed that supposedly China was bullying other countries in the region and threatening to use military force. He didn't mention that China has not fought a war since 1979, but Hegseth claimed that China is his big threat and the US is going to protect Asia. And of course, its real goal is to maintain US hegemony in the region.
China seeks to become a hegemonic power in Asia, no doubt. It hopes to dominate and control too many parts of this vibrant and vital region. Through its massive military buildup and growing willingness to use military force to achieve its goals, including gray zone tactics and hybrid warfare, China has demonstrated that it wants to fundamentally alter the region's status quo. We cannot look away, and we cannot ignore it. China's behavior toward its neighbors and the world is a wake-up call, and an urgent one.
Now, this is all completely false and absurd. If you know anything about China's foreign policy, you will know that China has constantly emphasized over decades that it does not seek hegemony. And in fact, it doesn't want any country to have hegemony. This has been a slogan going back to Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, and today under China's president Xi Jinping. All of these leaders have emphasized that China is against colonialism, imperialism, and hegemony, or as they say in Chinese, hegemonism. This is constantly reiterated by Chinese diplomats. They use the Chinese term bachuan, which means hegemony, and they say they do not want hegemony. In fact, when the People's Republic of China normalized diplomatic relations with the United States and Japan in the 1970s, one of the causes of diplomatic conflict was that China insisted that in the joint statement signed by China and the US, and also in the joint statement signed by China and Japan, there had to be something known as the anti-hegemony clause. And Japan did not want to sign this. Of course, Japan was an imperial power that committed horrific crimes in the Asia-Pacific region, including in China. Japan colonized China and killed tens of millions of Chinese. So China has always insisted on imposing hegemony and imperialism. That is at the heart of the foreign policy of the People's Republic of China. Even some mainstream American scholars have admitted that China is not seeking hegemony. For instance, Foreign Policy magazine is one of the most elite establishment media outlets in the US, and they published an article by Stephen Walt, who is a professor of international relations at Harvard University, the elite Ivy League university, and he admitted that China does not want hegemony. And what this is really about is an attempt by the US empire to maintain its hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. So the US is actually accusing China of what Washington wants. Washington is afraid of the fact that its hegemony is weakening. So the US is trying to pressure other countries in Asia, trying to force them to join the US in its new Cold War on China to weaken China to try to maintain US hegemony. And in fact, in this speech that the US Defense Secretary delivered at the Shangri-La Dialogue Conference in Singapore, Pete Hegseth essentially told countries in the region that they should minimize their economic relations with China. They should not trade too much with China. He was essentially telling these countries that they have to choose between either the US or China, that they can't have good relations with both sides because a war could be coming soon. And if these countries are economically integrated with China, it would make it difficult for the US military to wage war. As he put it, it would complicate our defense decision space. Listen here.
Facing these threats, we know that many countries are tempted by the idea of seeking both economic cooperation with China and defense cooperation with the United States. Now, that is a geographic necessity for many. But beware the leverage that the CCP seeks with that entanglement. Economic dependence on China only deepens their malign influence and complicates our defense decision space during times of tension.
Now, a big part of the speech delivered by Pete Hegseth was focused on Taiwan. For decades, the US government has supported separatist forces in Taiwan, even though the US technically recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. When the US government normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, the US signed a series of diplomatic agreements known as the Three Communiques, in which the US agreed to the One China principle, or the One China policy, in which the US recognized that there's only one China in the world and Taiwan is part of China. This is written into international law. The United Nations considers Taiwan a province of China, and even US-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, where the US is the only country with veto power. The IMF is based in Washington, D.C. And yet, if you go to the IMF website, it says very clearly, Taiwan, province of China. But in this speech delivered by the US Defense Secretary, he fearmongered about Taiwan. He said communist China wants to invade Taiwan. And he said that this would be a threat to the Asia-Pacific region and the world.
Every day, you see it. China's military harasses Taiwan. It has to be clear to all that Beijing is credibly preparing to potentially use military force to alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Again, to be clear, any attempt by communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it.
By the way, Pete Hegseth is known for having this very strange tendency where he's constantly referring to U.S. soldiers as war fighters. You know, he's a hardline neoconservative war hawk. And throughout this speech and other speeches, he constantly boasted about how the U.S. military is all about lethality, and it's the most lethal fighting force in the world, full of war fighters.
So we're focused on lethality, meritocracy, accountability, standards, readiness, and warfighting. We are revitalizing our defense industrial bases and reallocating resources toward the most lethal and effective capabilities. We're doing this because success of the warfighters requires it, to see an integrated defense industrial base supporting those forces and standing ready to keep them in the fight. We announced that we're upgrading U.S. Forces Japan headquarters. This is about warfighting and deterrence.
And he also boasted that Donald Trump is boosting the U.S. military budget to more than $1 trillion to prepare for war.
Our second priority is rebuilding the military. We're equipping American warfighters with the most advanced capabilities so that we remain the strongest and most lethal fighting force in the world. President Trump is spending, for the first time ever, over $1 trillion next year to do this, a 13% increase in American defense spending.
So what the Pentagon was trying to do in this speech is tell countries in Asia that the U.S. military will work with them against China to deter so-called aggression by China. Although, again, China has not been involved in a war since 1979. The U.S. is at war every single year, constantly, including in Asia. And yet we're supposed to believe that China is a threat. And anyway, Pete Hegseth is telling these countries, join the U.S., join us against China.
We will stand with you and work alongside you to deter Chinese aggression. Each day, together, creating more and more dilemmas and complications should China want to act.
However, I have to say that this U.S. strategy is not going very well. You know, the U.S. is trying to force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to pick a side, either the U.S. or China. But most countries are actually maintaining good relations with both sides. A good example of this was in May, there was a meeting held between the members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and also China, Japan, and South Korea. and they released a joint statement saying that they're going to deepen their cooperation, especially economically. And this came after another meeting was held in March between China, Japan, and South Korea, in which they talked about ways to promote and deepen economic ties and even talked about signing a free trade agreement. And in this meeting, and also in the meeting with ASEAN, one of the biggest issues discussed was the threat of tariffs by the US government. Trump has threatened to impose high tariffs not only on China, but also on many countries in ASEAN like Vietnam, and even on longtime US allies like Japan and South Korea. And this has angered many countries in the region, which is why instead of joining the US in this new Cold War, they've been maintaining a non-aligned foreign policy with good relations with both sides. And it also helps that China is the largest trading partner of ASEAN and Japan and South Korea. So they're not going to sacrifice their own economic interests on behalf of the United States, although that's what Washington wants. And by the way, all of these countries are already part of a trade bloc called the RCEP or RCEP, which stands for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The US is not part of RCEP. So the US is trying to force all of these countries to go against their own economic interests to benefit the US empire at their expense. And obviously, even longtime US allies like Japan and South Korea are not going to voluntarily do that. And another example of this increasing non-aligned foreign policy in the region is a historic summit that was held in Malaysia on the 27th of May that brought together ASEAN, the Gulf countries, the Persian Gulf countries in the GCC, and China. This was the first ever ASEAN GCC China summit, and it didn't get much attention in the Western media, but I think this was historic, and it's a clear symbol of the increasingly multipolar world that we're living in. So it's obvious that the US attempt to force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to join its new Cold War against China is completely failing. But in the speech that Pete Hegseth gave, he boasted about the growing partnership that the US has with India.
For example, look no further than to our growing defense relationship with India, where we pass new milestones by the day, from shared ventures of our defense industries to the increased operational coordination and interoperability between our two militaries.
However, I have to say that even in the case of India, the situation is not as clear as the US government would like the world to think. So yeah, India and the US do have good relations, but recently the Indian government has been trying to improve its relations with China. Clearly, China-India relations are very complicated, but before the BRICS summit that was held in Russia in 2024, China and India made an important breakthrough in their diplomatic relations. And relations were getting better until the conflict between India and Pakistan. And by the way, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that US politicians and war hawks in Washington have been encouraging more conflict between India and Pakistan because China and Pakistan are close allies. So the US wants to worsen relations between China and India by fueling more conflict between India and Pakistan. But again, despite that, the situation is not as clear-cut as Washington would like the world to think. And India also very much has a non-aligned foreign policy. India has good relations with the US. It also has very good relations with Russia. And its relations with China have been improving. So even there, Pete Hegseth is exaggerating the impact of this US strategy of divide and conquer. However, there is one country that is essentially volunteering to be the Ukraine of the Asia-Pacific region that is allowing the US empire to use it as a battering ram against China, and that's the Philippines. The Philippines is currently governed by Ferdinand Marcos Jr., known as Bongbong Marcos. He's the son of the brutal military dictator of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who was a very corrupt right-wing leader. His family stole billions of dollars of wealth from the Philippines. But the reason that he was able to maintain an iron grip on power as this brutal dictator for so many years is because during the first Cold War, the US empire strongly supported him. And today, in the second Cold War, in Cold War II against China, the US is using Bongbong Marcos in the Philippines as an outpost to try to weaken China. The US is using at least 9 military bases in the Philippines that were voluntarily given over. Control over them was given over by Bongbong Marcos, this corrupt oligarch. And the US has deployed a missile system to the northern part of the Philippines known as the Typhoon missile system, which has a range of nearly 2,000 kilometers and can hit most of the cities in mainland China. And this is obviously a clear threat to China. And when Pete Hegseth, when the Pentagon talks about the first island chain.
So first, the Defense Department is prioritizing forward-postured, combat-credible forces in the Western Pacific to deter by denial along the first and second island chains.
They're talking about the chain of islands going from the East China Sea and Okinawa down south past Taiwan, past the Philippines into the South China Sea, and ending down in Southeast Asia. And the US has been militarizing the first island chain, trying to force these authorities in the region, these governments, to allow the US military to put missile systems in their territory. And the only government that has been willing to do this is the Philippines. And they're essentially making themselves a major target if there is a US-China war. But the other governments in the region have not been as stupid, frankly, as the leadership of the Philippines, which is run by corrupt right-wing US puppets. And these other governments are saying, no, we do not want to be blown up in a US-China war. So again, this US strategy of divide and conquer to try to force the other parts of the Asia-Pacific region to unite with the US against China, that strategy is failing. The vast majority of governments in the region are not going along with Washington's new Cold War. It's basically just the Philippines and Australia. So these two colonial outposts. By the way, the US empire colonized the Philippines in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. The US empire took over former Spanish colonies, including Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. And also, Australia was created as a British settler colony. It was actually originally a penal colony where the British Empire sent its prisoners, and then Australia later got independence. But so we see that these two colonial outposts are really the only countries that have gone full in the new Cold War, supporting the US, allowing the US empire to use them as forward operating bases for war on China. But the other governments in the region do not want to be the new Ukraine. So just like how the US pushed Ukraine into a proxy war with Russia, fighting into the last Ukrainian, now the US is preparing to fight to the last Filipino or to the last Australian. But it's very clear that the US government is waging a new Cold War, and Washington is trying to blackmail and pressure countries all around the world to join it in this new Cold War against China. And not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but in the speech, Pete Hegseth also threatened Panama. And he said that the US is trying to reimpose its hegemony on the Western Hemisphere. This is a reference to the colonial Monroe Doctrine. And he said that the US empire is going to take control over the Panama Canal, which is colonialism, blatant 21st century neocolonialism.
We're also increasing security in the Western Hemisphere and taking back the Panama Canal from malign Chinese influence. It is key terrain, after all. China did not build that canal. We did. And we will not allow China to weaponize it or control it. Deterrence starts in our own backyard. But beyond our borders and beyond our neighborhood, we are reorienting toward deterring aggression by communist China.
Now, before I wrap up here, I want to emphasize two very important points. The first is that this new Cold War that the US is waging against China is bipartisan. It's not just Republicans who are pushing for war on China, but also Democrats. Now, the Republicans in the Trump administration are more blatant about it and more explicit, using bombastic, very aggressive rhetoric, but their policies are quite similar to those of the Democrats who came before them, and especially the Joe Biden administration. And this was actually admitted openly by Eli Ratner, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs under Biden. So he was a top Pentagon official in the Biden administration. And of course, he's a China hawk. And on Twitter, he said very clearly that despite all of the very aggressive, bombastic rhetoric in Pete Hegseth's speech, he said that there was, quote, near total continuity with the previous administration, end quote. So this is a top former Biden official saying that there was near total continuity in the Biden Pentagon's China policy and in the Trump Pentagon's China policy. And he said this is a good thing. This war hawk in Washington considers this to be a good thing. He said, quote, that's good, but we'll need heightened urgency, attention, and resources to address the China challenge, end quote. So that's really the main difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. The rhetoric of the Republicans is more explicit and aggressive and openly colonial, and they say China is a threat. Whereas the Democrats, they talk about the rules-based international order and human rights and democracy, but they basically have the exact same policy, which is an imperialist policy, a neo-colonial policy, trying to maximize the power of the U.S. empire, trying to impose U.S. hegemony on the world. And instead of calling China a threat, they call China a challenge. But it's really a superficial difference. Now, the other point that I want to make before I conclude is about the Orwellian rhetoric of the U.S. government. You know, the U.S. empire has been at war for hundreds of years nonstop. It's constantly waging war around the world. And yet it says, we want peace. We only have to wage war in order to defend peace. It's this Orwellian idea that war is peace. And this is so clear in the rhetoric of Trump's Pentagon. Pete Hegseth constantly says that they want peace through deterrence. And he claims that they don't want war with China, but they have to prepare for war with China because supposedly it's China that wants war, even though China has not fought a war since 1979. And in the speech that Pete Hegseth gave, he claimed that the Trump administration doesn't want war and they're not trying to encircle and contain China.
The United States, especially under President Trump, does not seek war. We do not seek to dominate or strangle China, to encircle or provoke.
Now, this is completely false. It's a lie. How do we know this? Because Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary, the billionaire hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, admitted that the U.S. government has a grand encirclement plan to try to contain China. Bloomberg reported on this in April. It noted that Scott Bessent said that the U.S. is trying to pressure Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India to come together to, quote, approach China as a group, end quote, in what was described as a, quote, grand encirclement strategy, end quote. So this is by definition an attempt to encircle China. And once again, this imperialist strategy is bipartisan. It's not just the Trump administration. If you go back and look at an important speech that was given by Biden's neoconservative Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in 2022, he admitted that the U.S. is pursuing a containment strategy against China. As he said, Washington is trying to, quote, shape the strategic environment around Beijing, end quote. That's just a fancy way of saying Cold War style containment.
But we cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system.
Every empire in history has always claimed to be acting in self-defense. Every aggressive warmongering country, when it starts a war, claims that it had to wage the war out of self-defense. And the US empire is doing exactly the same today, claiming we don't want war with China, but we just have to prepare for war with China in order to maintain US hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, where the U.S. is not located. The U.S. is in the Atlantic region. That's why it's the leader of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But the goal of the U.S. empire is to not only maintain hegemony in the Asia-Pacific, but in the entire world. And that's why the U.S. is so desperate to try to weaken and contain and encircle China. That's the goal of the new Cold War, to isolate, weaken, and eventually overthrow the Communist Party of China so the US empire can do to China what it did to Russia, to the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. Privatize all of China's assets, sell them off to Western companies, privatize all of China's state-owned enterprises, install obedient puppets in China like Boris Yeltsin in Russia, who will do whatever the US wants. And ultimately, the US empire would like to territorially break up China, carve off parts of China like Taiwan and Tibet and Hong Kong. That's the goal of the US empire. And that's why, as the Pentagon admits, it is preparing for war with China. If you want to learn more about the US military's preparations for war with China and how Silicon Valley big tech corporations are profiting from this, in the description below, I will link to a report and another video that I did looking at more evidence showing how dangerous Washington's new Cold War drive is. On that
China is a potential adversary. They're doing a lot of things well. They have a lot of problems. What I really worry about is us.
Welcome, this is Nochibam in-house with GBS Deep Dive. In another tit-for-tat exchange between the two superpowers, China and United States. On Monday, China reacted strongly to comments by the US president that he made on Friday, saying that China had totally violated its agreement with us. So much for being Mr. Nice Guy. And he threatened that the United States would take strong measures to defend its interests. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has also made similar comments, to the effect saying that China has not been a reliable partner and claimed that it was holding back products in the global supply chain. In response, China's Ministry of Commerce said Washington has seriously undermined the agreement that was reached during talks in Geneva last month, when both countries lowered tariffs on goods and imported from each other. The US has continued to unilaterally provoke new economic and trade frictions, increasing the uncertainty and instability in the bilateral economic and trade relations. The spokesperson also said that the United States' actions have severely violated the consensus that was reached during the phone call in January that was made between China's leader Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. The Chinese Commerce Ministry said that the US accusations were seriously contrary to the facts, claiming that Beijing had strictly implemented and actively upheld the agreements and cited its steps to cancel and suspend the certain tariff and non-tariff measures that were announced in April in response to Trump's reciprocal trade. The trade truce, which was struck in mid-May in Geneva, saw the United States lowering its tariffs imposed on goods from China from 145% down to 30%. And China's retaliatory tariffs on the United States goods dropped from 125% down to 10%. At the time, it was called a major trade breakthrough. But literally, days after the tariffs were lowered, the United States issued further technology export controls on Chinese companies getting chips. And then it announced a broad sweep of measures against issuing Chinese students visas. China has in return moved very slowly on easing those rare earth mineral exports, which the United States industry desperately needs. Over the weekend, Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth warned that the threat from China in the Indo-Pacific was real and imminent.
The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not.
Now, none of this looks like the two countries are mending fences. And unlike the softer, more conciliatory approach China took to appease Donald Trump in his first administration, this time round they see themselves in a very different position, and they're playing hardball. Beijing views these actions undertaken by the United States as part of Trump's efforts to dial up the pressure on China in future trade negotiations. By contrast, it seems that the White House is deluding itself. They think they can use that same playbook and get results. Officials still expect that the two countries' leaders will hold talks very soon, some even suggesting this week. Now, Trump's "so much for being Mr. Nice Guy" comment reflects his usual characteristic transactional approach and his personal framing of all international diplomacy. It's always about him, basically. And the president thinks he will strike this master deal with President Xi himself on the phone. Now, even Treasury Secretary Bessent has said on TV interviews that details of the trade talks will be ironed out once Xi and Trump speak.
I'm confident that when President Trump and Party Chairman Xi have a call, that this will be ironed out.
Whereas the Chinese like operating in a very different way. China's governance structure relies on bottom-up negotiations, which expect a comprehensive groundwork set out before any high-level meeting.
China has demonstrated that it wants to fundamentally alter the region's status quo. We cannot look away and we cannot ignore it. China's behavior toward its neighbors and the world is a wake-up call and an urgent one.
Now, they may even be amenable to Trump's personalized style if they thought it would stick. But so far, they're not sure if they can rely on President Trump, who has become known as Taco. Trump always chickens out. Now, he may say one thing and then he does another. The rift between the two countries is not only about economics, it's strategic. The sharp rhetoric from the United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth reflects clearly that the United States is not looking to work together with China. Rather, in his pointed address over the weekend, addressing the annual defense summit at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, he urged Asian allied nations to boost their defense spending and to push back against Beijing.
China's behavior toward its neighbors and the world is a wake-up call and an urgent one.
Hegseth also said that the United States was prepared to fight and win against China if deterrence failed. China's defense minister, Dong Xuan, was absent at this year's summit, which is a rare departure from its tradition of dispatching the top military official to the annual event for the first time since 2019. Pete Hegseth showed his annoyance at this and said, "We are here this morning, somebody else isn't."
We are here this morning and somebody else isn't.
Beijing instead sent a lower-ranking delegation to the conference, making it clear that they were not interested in providing a gladiatorial-style engagement with the United States for entertainment in the world. Responding to Hegseth's stringent remarks, China's warned the United States not to play with fire. China's embassy in Singapore said that the United States itself is the biggest troublemaker for regional and political stability. A spokesperson for China's defense ministry criticized Hegseth on Sunday for instigating Cold War mentality. This is a remark that has been said on numerous occasions by the Chinese, the Cold War mentality that the United States is expressing. And they've also said it's severely challenging China's sovereignty and rights. China's foreign ministry issued a strong statement saying that China urges the United States to fully respect the efforts of countries in the region to maintain peace and stability, stop deliberately destroying the peaceful and stable environment cherished by the region, and stop inciting conflict and confrontation and escalating tensions in the region. According to a story in Reuters, the United States government plans to ramp up weapon sales to Taiwan to a level beyond the $18.3 billion authorized during Trump's first term, and it's surpassing the amount that's $8.4 billion, which was approved under President Biden. What the United States will do is still up for question, given that during the election campaign trail, Trump suggested that Taiwan should pay to be protected, and he also accused the island of stealing American semiconductor business, which did cause alarm in Taipei at the time. Now, the US is pushing Taiwan to increase its defense spending to 3%, and they've reportedly asked the opposition parties to agree to it. Generally, though, most Asian nations are not perceiving the same military threat from China, which the United States is telling them. And we can expect them to actually ignore most of these calls from the US to increase their defense spending. Currently, they work closely both with the United States and with China, and they don't really wish to play camp in either. Simultaneously, the diplomatic chill is hitting academia. In a move that blindsided universities across the country, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, announced sweeping restrictions on Chinese student visas, citing national security concerns. He announced that affected students will include those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. We will also revise the visa criteria to enhance scrutiny of all future visa applications from the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong. The Trump administration argues that Chinese students are a national security risk because they return to China with American know-how and that can facilitate intellectual property theft. While in the United States, members of Congress also have alleged that some Chinese students could be used in state espionage campaigns and that they pose security risks to universities that receive federal funding. On the other hand, many United States educational institutions are now warning of severe financial and reputational fallout. Chinese students, 99% of which pay full tuition, have long helped to subsidize public universities, and research labs in STEM fields are heavily reliant on their talent. Until last year, China was the biggest source of foreign students in the United States, but it has been overtaken by India as these tensions with China accumulate. There are nearly 280,000 Chinese students currently in the United States. During Trump's first administration in 2020, to stop intellectual property theft, the United States started to screen Chinese graduate students who wished to do research in the US for potential military ties. Now, they are taking it to the next level. These moves by the United States would be a disaster for the country itself. A 2022 study done by Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology found that 90% of Chinese nationals who came to the US to study in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM fields, between the years 2000 and 2015 actually stayed and worked in the US. They graduated and they contributed to scientific fields in the country itself. And whole STEM departments in universities and research centers across the country are being run by those of Chinese origin. A research by another think tank shows that of the 25 leading American artificial intelligence companies that set up recently were founded by entrepreneurs that were born either in China or in India. Critics are arguing that this crackdown, while politically expedient, actually risks undermining American scientific leadership and diminishing one of the United States' most powerful forms of soft power. President Xi Jinping's own daughter actually went to Harvard for her undergraduate education. The technology front has been proven equally contentious. Just days after the Geneva tariff truce, the United States slapped new semiconductor export controls on Chinese firms, a move that Beijing has condemned as being discriminatory abusive of trade power. China has called out the US for discriminatory restrictions in its use of export controls in the chip industry. They said this in response to Trump's accusation that the world's second largest economy has violated a preliminary trade deal between the two countries in May. A couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration removed the Biden administration's AI diffusion rules that has set up this convoluted system of where the semiconductor chips could be sold and in which amounts. Now, the chips industry had generally been lobbying hard against these. However, when the current administration removed these, they then went on to ban American companies from importing or even using Chinese giant Huawei AI chips. They also inserted, before removing, a worldwide so-called guidance on buying these Huawei chips. Chip software makers, including Synopsys and Cadence Design Systems, said that they had received letters from the US Commerce Department telling them to stop selling to China. Now, I've done a detailed vlog on these measures and we'll put a link to it in the description, so do go and check it out. Now, these measures have reignited fears of a full-blown technological decoupling as Washington is attempting to slow down China's progress in the advanced computing section. As Washington attempts to slow down China's progress in advanced computing sector, while protecting its own supply chains. But critics, including NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, has recently warned that such a unilateral move risks backfiring. It's going to, and it has done so, spur innovation in China, and it's going to push neutral countries to question the reliability of US technology partners. One of the major bugbears for the US side is China's control over the critical materials that are used to make chips, cars, military equipment, and so on. And it has slowed down that process to give out these licenses, the export licenses for these minerals, which is affecting United States industries. Now, these critical minerals are a powerful lever for Beijing, and it will give it a strong leverage in the trade talks that it needs. China has also narrowed the technological gap with the United States. As part of its Made in China 2025 plan, it has raced ahead in many strategic sectors, such as the renewable energy products, the robotics, and artificial intelligence. Such progress makes the country, China, less vulnerable to the United States sanctions than it would have been in the past. By late April, as tariffs started hurting major United States businesses, Walmart's, Target's, and Wall Street investors, Bill Ackman, were all making it very clear that the United States could not afford a trade war. Those sky-high tariffs on both sides were threatening to disrupt the supply chains and empty store shelves in the United States. And it was not about those girls buying $1 or $2 for Christmas, as Trump said. While Trump sent his negotiation team in May to Geneva to talk to the Chinese, he's still been acting as if he has the upper hand. Witness the United States' actions on those export controls or the Chinese student visas. Scott Besant's suggestion that a trade deal similar to that which was achieved in Trump's first administration is the model in which China upped its buying of American products and the United States still kept significant tariffs, up to 25% on almost half of everything China sold to the US. Now, this is a model that he wants, but it's no longer welcomed by the Chinese this time round. That deal has become to be seen within the country as the modern-day version of those unequal treaties that the country signed during the mid-19th century, part of what China terms as its century of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. China this time round will be aiming to keep those tariffs that it has achieved already during this 90-day pause and buying those American products that it actually wants, whether it's soybeans or American chips. For the United States, it would do well, and Trump would do well, to heed the words of JP Morgan Chase's CEO, Jamie Dimon, who recently said that China isn't America's biggest threat. And what the United States should do is to look inward. In his words, China is a potential adversary. They're doing a lot of things well, but they have a lot of problems as well. What I really worry about is us. Can we get our own act together? Our own values, our own capability, our own management.
Is a potential adversary. They're doing a lot of things well. They have a lot of problems. What I really worry about is us. Can we get our own act together, our own values, our own capability, our own management?
His remarks highlight a critical question often overshadowed by the external focus. Can the United States revitalize its economic infrastructure, innovation ecosystem, and social cohesion to remain competitive on the world stage? Yet this inward-looking counsel seems at odds with the current policy trajectory, which is basically prioritizing containment and decoupling over engagement as the solution for the United States to remain the primary superpower in the world. The risks of this hardline approach are multiple. Decoupling supply chains and limiting academic exchange threatens not only economic efficiency, but also the flow of ideas and collaboration that have historically driven innovation. Meanwhile, China's accelerating its efforts to develop indigenous technologies, diversifying its trade partnerships, and strengthening its regional influence, all actions that could ultimately diminish American leverage in global affairs. Now, in this context, any upcoming leadership dialogues between President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, if they indeed take place, will be pivotal. Can they break through this current impasse? It depends heavily on the groundwork laid by their respective bureaucracies and on mutual willingness to compromise beyond those transactional optics that are happening. Both countries do face that domestic pressures that will constrain their flexibility. In the United States, we have political polarization and strategic hawks that want that all-out confrontation. In China, it has its own nationalistic expectations, and the leadership needs to ensure the protection of its sovereignty and core interests. Thank you for giving me your time today, and do share with me your thoughts. Do you think
Hi, everybody. Today's Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025, and our friend Pepe Escobar is back with us. Welcome back, Pep.
The house is rocking. Nima, it's a pleasure to be with you because today is one of the craziest days I had in Russia in years. I've been working for 15 hours nonstop. It's 11 p.m. now in Moscow, and the atmosphere is electric. And I'm sure all of you know why. Because there's a major decision hovering over everyone in Russia and Eurasia and the rest of the world. And it all depends on the wisdom of the Russian leadership on how they're going to respond to an attack against strategic nuclear assets of the Russian Federation. It does not get more serious than that. So I assume all of you, our audience, can have at least a glimpse of how hardcore the situation is at the moment.
Yeah, I think we can jump in right to the new article that you've written. Let me share the link to
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, here is what you wrote, Pepe. It's about waiting for the Oreshniks. What are you trying to say in this article? And you've mentioned the situation in Russia in the aftermath or during the attacks.
Yes.
Ukrainian attack on one of the most strategic parts of Russian military, which is the nuclear bombers. Go ahead, your take.
Well, I start the article with the mood in Moscow this Monday. Of course, the attack was on Sunday. One day after I arrived here on Saturday, thinking that I will have a relatively calm weekend before starting to work in Russia again. On Sunday, this whole thing explodes, and obviously people didn't sleep from Sunday to Monday. The mood on Monday until Tuesday morning, this morning, when I wrote this column, I start with the mood and the three main points, sort of universal consensus in a way, plus information that I gathered at the dinner yesterday night with an absolutely top intel source here in Moscow. The first thing, there is a consensus among intelligence agencies, diplomats, think tanks, very well-informed people, that this was a NATO operation, but essentially US, UK, CIA, MI6. What nobody knows for sure is which CIA and which MI6. Was it straight from the top, or were rogue factions working inside the CIA and inside the MI6 talking, of course, obviously, their dialogues, their underground dialogues. And of course, Ukraine was a mere executor, not very competent, as it took a while to ascertain. There were 5 bases were supposed to be attacked, and in the end, only 2 were attacked. That absolutely hysterical propaganda offensive all across the West basically regurgitating Ukrainian points that over 40 strategic bombers in Russia had been decimated, which would be at the time 34% of the Russian strategic fleet, which is completely absurd. So now, more or less, it's established that at best, 5 Tu-95s may have been hit and possibly, let's say, out of work. Possibly 2 or 3 will be out of work and the others can be repaired. The number that I had yesterday night from my source is 3. It maybe it's not enough. Maybe it's the number that is being floated by the intelligence agencies. Let's say 5. Saturday to Sunday, the strategic fleet of strategic Tu-95 strategic bombers of Russia was 58. So if you have 5 out of work, that's less than 10%. So in terms of producing any alteration in the battlefield, negligible. And this is already a fact here, and it's considered a fact by the best Russian analysts. An example. These past few weeks, the Tu-95 is using X-101 missiles. Each plane carries 6 missiles. Sorry, each plane carries 8 missiles, and they have been using 6 planes. So to keep the very, very strong pace of strikes by Russia of these past few weeks, they only need 6 Tu-95s. They don't need 58. So that after the initial shock, of course, because this was a national shock all over Russia, big thing. It is a political humiliation, even if it's not a military humiliation in the end. So after, let's say, 24 hours, spirits started to calm down and people start paying attention to the response. That's why I used waiting for the Oreshniks in my title. Because the popular consensus, and this goes from the high echelon of powers to the intel agencies, to diplomats, to think tanks, and to the general public, is that now, okay, that's it. That's it. You know, release the Oreshniks, all of them, and a massive wave of ballistic missiles. So this is more or less the mood of Russian public opinion after this attack. And this attack combined with the terrorist attack in Bryansk, which all of you will remember, where those gangsters in Kiev blew up a bridge on purpose so the bridge would fall over a passing civilian train. So this is an act of mega terror, in fact. Well, there were, of course, lethal victims, but not as many as expected, hopefully, of course, and dozens of wounded as well. And the craziest thing, the train, the railroad is back in action. It's going to take 3 or 4 months to rebuild the bridge, but the trains keep on going. That's Russian efficiency when they apply themselves to it, you know. So this is part of these 3 main points. The first one, that it's a US, UK, CIA, MI6 layers between CIA and MI6 operation. So essentially NATO, but only the Anglo-Americans. The popular mood of release the Oreshniks because we had enough of being victims of terror attacks. And the third point is very, very crucial, Nima, because this is exactly what they are discussing now at night at the Kremlin still, with the guys from the Security Council, with the heads of the agencies, SVR, FSB, everybody. Was Trump in the loop? And if he was not, if he was blindsided by the neocons, which, as we know, is towers and silos all across the Beltway in Washington, in Virginia, in Maryland, in the CIA, National Security Council, you name it, industrial military complex as a whole. So was he blindsided? Was he kept out of the loop? So in this case, who gave the green light for this operation. This is what the Russians are, I would say, 24/7, non-stop. They are trying to establish the chain of command and establish with us, I would say, a measure of certainty where this green light, this authorization came from. Anyway, the fact that this thing happened, it's beyond imagination, because when you think that during the Cold War, something like that could never happen, never happened. There was a degree of two adults in the house, the US and the USSR, and they had lots of mechanisms to prevent something like this happening, which would be immediately interpreted by the other side as a strategic attack. So we have these gangsters in Kiev, supported by neocons in the US, the Chihuahua warmongers in Europe, obviously, including, of course, especially the UK, and especially MI6, which this is a typical MI6 style operation, sabotage, covert operation, sabotage, black ops by definition. They blew up what we had during the Cold War, which was an adult relationship between the superpowers. Now the New START Treaty, which was voted many years ago, which was approved many years ago, and it runs until February next year, where it will be dead and buried. It was dead and it's dead and buried now because of the actions of a bunch of gangsters, neo-Nazi gangsters in Kiev. So we can assume with a degree of certainty that responsible people at the Pentagon, at the National Security Council in Washington, they must be fuming if they were out of the loop. And that's where the situation becomes even more complex, because in the middle of this fog of war, if we have the President of the United States out of the loop of a decision that could, if interpreted by the Russians as a direct attack, the beginning of a nuclear war, really, absolutely, because according to the new Russian nuclear doctrine approved by Putin only a few months ago, this is an attack in one of the branches of the so-called Russian nuclear triad, the strategic bombers that may carry nuclear weapons. Which brings us to a very important question, which many of us in our columns and our analysis are stressing. Why these strategic bombers were unprotected in the tarmac at their bases? Because this is a stipulation of the New START Treaty. And I'm going to read it for you, Nima, and for all of you in our audience, what the treaty actually says. Signed in 2010, exactly. I had to remember the date of 2010. In my mind, it was the beginning of the 2000s, but the exact date is 2010 and extended till February next year. So, so this is the key part. The New START Treaty stipulates that strategic bombers should be visible to, between commas, now I am quoting them, national technical means, NTM, of verification, such as satellite imagery, to allow monitoring by the other party. What does that mean? This means that if satellites are looking at the strategic bombers parked in the tarmac in a base, they can see if they are nuclear armed, if they have been converted to conventional use, if they are just there lying in the sun, So this can be verified. And obviously, this eliminates the possibility of a surprise, and I put it between commas, first strike, which is the obsession of a lot of people, a lot of the warmongers in the US. So this operation, we can say that single-handedly blew up the arrangement and blew up the New START Treaty completely. It was a very simple mechanism that was, until this weekend, was working fine for the Russians, for the Americans. They didn't even discuss that anymore. So, and that brings us once again to the key question of these three main points in the beginning of my column. I put it this way. There's no surprise that the highest echelons of power in Russia, from the Kremlin to the security apparatus, are feverishly working to ascertain whether Trump was in the loop or not. And if he was not, who gave the final green light? I had this discussion with my interlocutor yesterday in detail. And today I was on the phone for almost an hour with our friend Alistair Crook. We share the same analysis, Alistair and I. And his main point is he's also very fearful that Trump was not in the loop. This is something obviously nobody can prove it at the moment or even in the foreseeable future. There will be no leaks about it, possibly not, right? And even if there were, the White House would say, no way. But this is immensely dangerous, because if this is the case, and the Russians need to know more or less, they have to find the culprits. And this is going to be very, very hard, because it will be diffused among silos of the CIA, silos of MI6, who was running this project inside the CIA or connected to CIA, and then inside MI6 or connected to MI6, and making the connections with the gangsters in Kiev. So I think this more or less can give you, Nima, and our audience, the gravity of the situation. This is immensely serious and explains the silence by the Kremlin, by everybody. We can say that Medvedev more or less broke the silence in a manner that is very non-Medvedev. We know that Medvedev is the king of trolling. He has a lot of sense of humor. It's always very, very funny. This time he's dead serious. He wrote, everything that has to be blown up will be blown up, and everybody that needs to be punished will be punished. This is very, very serious, because this is exactly the framework of what the Russians are thinking, is how they're going to frame their response. And at the end of my column, I address what may be the key overarching question involving all that and beyond. Russia is fighting the whole collective West, as we all know, the whole of NATO, the whole of the collective West, militarily, politically, economically, financially, etc. And Russia is winning. This is anathema, not only for the Chihuahuas in Europe, but for the ruling classes in the US. Maybe Trump doesn't understand the extent of it, but Trump doesn't understand strategy. And even worse, Trump doesn't read. If you don't read, you cannot understand what's going on now. So how can Russia have a response, specifically in this case where one vector of the strategic triad was attacked directly inside the Russian Federation without launching World War III? This is really and this is, of course, something that is very much in Putin's mind. But Putin, as we know, is a gradualist. He is very methodical. He analyzes all legalistic options when he makes a hardcore decision. So he has to come up with an appropriate response to a direct attack on nuclear strategic assets. It doesn't get more hardcore than this, right? And of course, in the long run, how can Russia gradually, and it has to be gradually, finally demonstrates to the collective West as a whole that Russia has the means to incapacitate them to wage war and cut off their will to wage war at the same time? So this is the big, big, big question up there, you know. So this is where we are at the moment, Nima. It's extreme. You couldn't get more serious than that. And of course, the mood in Moscow is, it's, I would say, silent fury encapsulates the mood. Tonight, for instance, I was having a dinner with the people related to BRICS. We were discussing basically BRICS, economics, etc. This is a conversation we can have later on before the summit in Rio. And these are seasoned professionals as well. They are in the financial markets. They had corporations and all that. And they were basically saying, yes, we all know it's a PR operation. We all know this was a direct attack against us. And of course, our response is going to be devastating. And after that, so what? Because the war will continue. And everybody's convinced that now that the war will continue until total capitulation and the elimination of this current setup in Kiev. So we are up several notches in the real war between Russia and not Ukraine, because between Russia and NATO, with Ukraine as the proxy. No? Very, very serious.
Yeah, you've mentioned that Donald Trump. They don't know if Donald Trump was involved in this sort of attack. But do you see anything Donald Trump doing that is helping himself in the?
No.
He's not doing anything. He's just attacking Russian president. He's 2 times, 3 times he attacked Putin, and despite doing this, nothing. I don't see Donald Trump. Even Witkoff is not in the scene anymore. He's not in the scene. He started these sort of negotiations. But right now, with the new talks, how can you believe that Zelensky is negotiating for peace, for agreement? How can you believe that if the outcome of that agreement is the removal of his administration?
Well, the only tiny elite, or self-appointed elite, in fact, of the European Chihuahuas, these are the only ones who actually believe that these negotiations will lead to a ceasefire and that Ukraine has a chance of winning. If you look at the Western media since Sunday, especially the British mainstream media, which is beyond, it's down in several layers of gutter, in fact, they're actually regurgitating that all over again. Ukraine shows that they have a chance of winning. It's more or less what they're saying everywhere, from the tabloids to the established papers. Nobody is a sane, rational actor can believe, especially when we look at what happened in Istanbul. The first part of my column, I more or less, it's a resume of Istanbul. Basically, Russia, once again, they explained in detail, 31 points, very detailed by Medinsky. They're not demands. In fact, the basic point, so there will be a ceasefire and later a peace agreement. With an extra addendum, which is very, very important. If we get to a peace agreement, and this is something that is so far away in the future, it has to be ratified by the UN Security Council in writing. What does that mean? That the United States and those 2 Chihuahuas, UK and France, they have to ratify it. We know that this is never going to happen. Russia and China, of course, 2 members. But the other 3 members of the Security Council will never ratify a de facto capitulation of Ukraine. And we all know, taking everything that, as stupid as it can be coming from the mouth of Macron, the BlackRock chancellor in Germany, or whoever, or those unimaginable specimens at the European Commission in Brussels, their bet is forever war. We all know that. So we come back once again to Trump's position. What is Trump's position? Not even Trump knows. It's absolutely disgusting because he's not a strategist. He doesn't think and he doesn't read. He doesn't have a strategy. It's simple. He doesn't even have tactics. He has a sort of once again manipulating narratives and twisting narratives to give the impression that he's working for peace. So only his diehard supporters in the US can actually believe that this is bears any resemblance to reality, and it's not a reality show as it is. On the administration, two facts that people paid a lot of attention here. Larry Johnson wrote about this. Alistair, we discussed this with Alistair today. My source yesterday, we were discussing this as well. Do you know who called? It was not Lavrov that called Marco Rubio. It was Marco Rubio who called Lavrov. And why? Because he wanted to express condolences for the civilian victims of the Bryansk bridge over a train terrorist attack. Not a word about the attack, the drone attack on the strategic bombers. At the same time, the head of the Pentagon, who has Kafir as one of his tattoos, as you all know, former commander of a lousy platoon in the Iraq War after 2003, then Fox News blah, blah, blah talk show, and now head of the Pentagon, Hegseth. He followed the whole drone attack live, in real time, live, Nima. So he knew exactly what was going on. So obviously you cannot say that the president didn't know what was going on. Can you imagine the head of the Pentagon not even calling the president, say, look, this is happening right now. So that adds a little more spice to the narrative, you know. And very significant, Trump's silence. He didn't say a word since Sunday. Nothing, absolutely nothing. For a guy who issues 25x tweets X a day, oops. So, you know, when you add this all up, of course, nobody knows anything. And this is why the Russians are studying this thing nonstop. But there is some evidence that he might have known something, but not the whole plot. If he knew about it, and even worse, if he gave the final go-ahead, okay, at the moment it's a very remote possibility. What does that mean in practice? An actual declaration of war by the United States against Russia. Can you imagine if the Russians would attack parked US strategic bombers on American soil out of the blue? Can you imagine the American reaction? We all know the American reaction will be. So because the Russians are very rational characters and they have this enormous patience, but now people here are saying, look, the bear has done talking. Now we're going to release the Oreshniks, you know, literally. Now it's becoming a war cry everywhere in Russia, you know. So, but of these three main points, NATO operation, US, UK, Intel services, Intel combo, organized everything, the strategy, the modus operandi, etc. They released the Oreshniks, popular mood in Russia. And still the most important thing is what is Trump's role in all this? And that's the key for a lot of what will happen afterwards.
Yeah. Pepe, we know that we had Lindsey Graham together with Blumenthal going to Ukraine. Even we had Mike Pompeo going to Odessa. These are not simple moves on the part of the people who are part of the Republican Party, who are so much important, so much connected with the Trump administration. You remember the next day of that it was announced that Donald Trump won the election. The next day we had J.D. Vance and Lindsey Graham talking to each other in a private meeting. And we know these people are so much connected. And here is what Lindsey Graham is talking about, Pepe. What do you make of it?
Said that Ukraine doesn't have good cards. Well, Russia's much bigger and has a lot more people. I get that. But the world has a lot of cards against Russia. And one of those cards that we have is about to be played in the United States Senate. In America, you have more than one person at the card table. We have three branches of government.
I mean, they don't care what Trump
And the House and the Senate are poised to act. What would change our mind? If Russia came to the table,
This man need to be arrested.
agreed to a ceasefire, and earnestly.
Who's the world? Who's the world that he's talking about? And he argued in this same video, in the other part of the video, he says that we have to punish China because they're helping Russia. We had Macron saying the same thing. Political reporter that Macron he said that we're gonna bring NATO to the Pacific, to South China Sea, if you don't take care of
Imperialist.
North Korean soldiers in Russia. They're picking a fight. This is a big fight happening and forming before our eyes, and it doesn't seem that anybody's caring about that.
Well, Lindsey Graham is a neocon, paid by neocons, financed by neocons historically, Russophobe, Islamophobe, Iranophobe, Xenophobe, everything. And extremely mediocre. He doesn't even know how to speak English properly. He speaks the English of a 7-year-old. It's a joke. Just play this tape again. You know, everything reduced to the minimal common denominator. So what do you expect from a guy like this? You know, he's a go-between, a messenger, a lowly messenger. You know, his role in the Senate is to do what he's doing. And now he's going against his own president from his own party. He's undermining whatever Trump is trying to do. Trump doesn't want more war with Russia. Theoretically. Maybe he has been playing everybody all along from the beginning. That's not the case. He wants some sort of deal where he and the US can make more money on the business angle, restarting trade with Russia. So this makes total sense considering the psychology of the character and what drives him, essentially. Graham, paid by the neocons as a lowly messenger, the only things that move him are related to forever wars. And that was us. If you remember, before the Iraq war, you know, when he was very, very friendly with that other unspeakable character, John McCain, that's absolutely the same thing, you know. It doesn't change anything. It's what's worrying is that these people, they open their mouths and it echoes not only domestically in the West, but globally. Mediocre individuals who cannot run a hot dog stand, but they open their mouths and, you know, influences people all over the world. That's what is so dangerous. And the American Senate, the American Congress, Capitol Hill as a whole, I would say it's a basket of absolutely mediocre characters, just like Graham, you know. 90% of them, at least, if not more. All of us who have lived in Washington, and when we have to interact with these characters, it's you know, it's repulsive. You go to Capitol Hill like this all the time, you know. Well,
what's so tragic right now, you see the same sort of rhetoric is coming out of Washington as it was during the Biden administration. We are getting to those days of the Biden administration. We are not getting to what Donald Trump was promising to do.
No.
And it is, here is what General Jack Keane said on Fox News, just to show how they're changing the rhetoric in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
The peace process exhibited by the United States to leverage someone to change their behavior. We've got to do the same thing with Russia. It is part of the process. It's not outside the process. And that means we got to leverage him. And we don't know if that will actually work. Let's be honest about it.
Yeah.
But we do know what is not working. And just the diplomatic talking is not working. So the leverage has got to be, I think, number one, military assistance, and give them the robust air defense systems and the other things they desperately need. Let's leverage Putin just as we did Zelensky. We don't know, let's be frank, if it's going to work, but it certainly is worth a try at this point, because diplomatic talks are not getting us there.
How can you not know after more than 3 years, we're approaching 4 years of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, you have to have the IQ of a dismembered worm, like most of these people do. And no offense to worms, by the way. So obviously these people, retired general who never won a fucking battle in his life, you know, what does he know about diplomacy? Nothing, obviously, no? So that's all predictable, Nima. The problem is, once again, America is ruled by TV. Just to give you another tiny example that is, I would say it's immensely significant. Do you know how Tulsi Gabbard is going to present her intel security briefings to Trump from now on? As Fox News segments with images and booming sound, because he only understands TV. This is a president that, just like other previous American presidents, he doesn't read. So can you imagine Trump not reading the intel briefings of the CIA, of the National Security Council, etc.? He doesn't. So obviously he's out of the loop, starting with himself, because his brain is out of the loop. It's beyond absurd, something like this, you know. So it's like the brain of a 6-year-old watching cartoons on TV, literally, you know. If you are the president, Putin reads everything 15, 17 hours a day. He reads dossiers. People confirmed to me here over these past 2 years, when I have conversations with people who get close to Putin on and off, usually academics, as they said, he reads thick reports like that, back to back, one after another. Or even if he does a transversal reading, like 15, 20 seconds, he reads in a way that in 20 seconds, he gets the feeling of what he's reading, so he can make a decision based on that. This is a president at work. That's another story. And that's why Putin can have a press conference of 4 or 5 hours, and he has all the numbers and the facts at his fingertips all the time. Trump, what do we see when is Trump capable of quoting something that somebody hasn't whispered to him in the past 5 or 10 minutes, or he just saw on Fox News? No, he can't. He can't. So it's totally uneven. So it's very easy to keep a president like that off the loop. It's very, very easy. For the moment, is the most plausible explanation to what happened. And obviously, can you imagine a guy with an ego the size of the Milky Way admitting in public that he was out of the loop of something so serious happening with the other superpower? He can't. So he is in a bind at the moment. And that explains his silence. The difference, the silence of the lambs and the silence of the wolves is a completely different story, right? Or the silence of the bears, in fact. Today I heard that 3 or 4 times at least, the bear has done talking. It's becoming a mantra all over here. Now it's time to act, finally, you know. And that explains, obviously, the Kremlin silence, because they have to act. They are very circumscribed, and the response has to be devastating, but at the same time, extremely measured, carefully measured. And on the other side, we have the president of the United States, who cannot even come out in public to condemn terrorist attacks against Russia, or at least say, no, this is what happened to Russia could not happen to us as well. This is totally absurd. And in fact, I was betrayed by this bloody gangster in Kiev, which is the case. But not only the bloody gangster in Kiev, his own intel services and the Brits' intel services at the same time. So he cannot possibly admit that in public, Nima.
Pepe, have you imagined that the United Kingdom would be that much capable of manipulating the Trump administration? They're so much in charge, in my opinion, right now. They're in charge of what's going on in Ukraine. It's not Donald Trump.
Well, of course, the MI6 runs Kiev, Nima. Everybody knows that, and for quite a while, much more than the Americans, no question. And all these sabotage operations, they were conducted by MI6. By the way, did you see the latest sabotage of the Kerch bridge, the Crimea bridge?
Yeah.
I just saw a photo a few minutes ago. The bridge is up and running absolutely normal, but it was being spun by the Ukrainians that they had bombed the Crimea bridge again. So this is obviously another MI6 style covert black ops. They are very good at that. There's no question. In fact, that's the only thing that they know how to do. They cannot fight a war. They don't have an army. They don't have anything. The UK now is a fifth world country, but they have a very competent black ops network. No question. And obviously they taught everything that they knew to the SBU, to the GUR, the military intelligence in Ukraine and all that. These are the guys who, let's say, implemented the last part of this drone attack against the strategic bombers. And here we can say that from the point of view of Russian foreign intelligence, they have more or less the roadmap. Maybe they don't have names. And it's very hard to get to names and the actual people responsible and running this operation from the beginning. This is going to be very hard. But from the point of view of a response, as long as they have the roadmap of how it happened, will be more than enough. And coming back to Medvedev, it's going to take a while for the second part of what he said. The first part is whatever needs to be blown up will be blown up, no question. Second part is whoever needs to be punished will be punished. This is going to take much longer.
You've mentioned, and you were talking with people connected to BRICS and what would happen at the BRICS summit. How do they find these secondary sanctions? They're talking about 500% tariffs on sanctions on Russian oil, which we know that they would influence China, mostly India, and eventually we have Europe being influenced, being affected by these sanctions. How do you think that Russia, with these new waves of sanctions, new waves of, you see the the American general suggesting more weapons to Ukraine, new sanctions coming. It seems that they know that they don't have any sort of leverage on Russia. That's why they're doing everything right now. They're trying to change the game. I'm afraid that's not going to work. It didn't work. It's not going to work. But we're going to have something so much, a new sort of confrontation between Russia and the West during the Trump administration.
People in business here, they're getting ready for anything, literally. They know that escalation is the name of the game, and the war and the different strands of hybrid war and the financial economic war will be going, off the charts completely. So Russian businesses are getting ready for it. It's complicated, but because they diversified so much and they have so many partners all across Eurasia and all across the global south, let's say in the mid-term, they are not so worried. Short term, they'll have to make adjustments, of course, especially if there is a case of these out of control tariffs on everything coming from Russia, literally, even a bottle of Baikal water, by the way, one of the best waters in the world. But they're getting ready for it. And they know that the hybrid war is not only against Russia, it's against the BRICS as a whole. So I wonder how deep this is going to be discussed at BRICS Summit in Rio. That's a very complicated question. Let's leave it for Rio, and then we'll discuss about it. And they told me, for instance, tonight they were telling me, look, last year, the Russians worked like crazy to advance BRICS. It's like they knew that this year, especially with a summit in the middle of the year instead of the end of the year, which is a stupid decision by the Brazilians, whichever way you look at it. They knew that there will be some deceleration. And of course, to incorporate the new members and the partners as well, it's a very complex affair. For instance, even though the relationship between Russia and India is very good, the Russians know that India is becoming, let's say, more disinterested in BRICS, because now they are concentrating once again on this intractable problem that they have with Pakistan, and the fact that China will support Pakistan all the way. So this is their number one priority. BRICS is not a priority to India anymore. There's still a very complex role of Saudi Arabia. We are in and we are out. We don't know. Nobody knows where we are, right? And of course, accommodating the new partners. So it's going to be complicated in Rio, and nobody is expecting big decisions. What my friends tonight were discussing is possibilities related to the new development bank. And there are some wonderful ideas already floating. And I hope President Dilma will be attentive to these new proposals. So this is like, let's say, something bright in the horizon. But the overall expectations vis-a-vis the summit, they are not very high.
We had the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He said China-US relations are at a critical point.
Mm-hmm.
The things are not happening, Pepe, as we expected. If you remember, Donald Trump was talking about arms control between Russia, China, and the United States. I don't see that coming.
No.
And the budget is, he wanted to reduce the budget, the military, that didn't happen, but increased. And Elon Musk is out of the government. Mm-hmm. How do you consider these sort of changes that are happening within the administration? How much of weight Elon Musk had, or the people close to him? We know that, at least I'm not gonna, many people are criticizing me because I'm talking about Elon Musk, but Elon Musk was not in favor of the war in Ukraine. He negotiated with Iranians. He was the first person of this administration who started talking with Iranians. Mm-hmm. And he didn't want a war with China. He's not in the scene right now. He is out of the government. What is happening to, when you look at the way China is talking about, Russia is talking about, with the Iranian nuclear deal, you see every day, every moment, they're coming out with a new rhetoric, 1%, 2%, 3%, and no enrichment. Last night, Donald Trump. There is somehow a huge confusion on the part of the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese when it comes to Donald Trump and his administration.
But the chaos is on the other side, Anima. Russia, China, and Iran, they have to react to the volatility and this never-ending circus coming out of Washington. And they try to react as rational actors. It's very, very difficult because they are dealing with something that is the incarnation of 10 reality shows in one. You know? It's very complicated. The work of spokespersons for the Chinese, the Iranians, and Peskov here is very, very, very difficult. Very difficult. Because on the other side, there's no strategy, there's no continuity, there's no roadmap, there's no appraisal of the powers of very good diplomacy at the highest level. So how do you deal with all that? So you're dealing with a vortex all the time. It's a kaleidoscope of demented I would say several layers of dementia and several layers of inconsistency and childish inconsistency coming from the presidency. You know, it's so you cannot deal with that steadily. You can't. So that's why we see the Iranians have to repeat the same thing over and over again. Do they understand that for us, no enrichment is a red line? Do they understand that we're not going to abandon our missile program? Do they understand that we'll never abandon the axis of resistance? Obviously not. So they have to repeat it over and over again. The Chinese, the same thing. If you don't treat us as equals, forget about anything. So they have to repeat this virtually every day, right? And the Russians, of course, it's complicated because there's a war going on. And in the beginning, we can say that Putin and the Security Council were betting on, okay, let's try to find some arrangement with the Americans, and then we can start discussing what Lavrov always describes perfectly, the root causes of this war. It's absolutely impossible. What happened in the Kabuki in Istanbul on Monday? Nothing strategic, absolutely not. Of course, from the point of view of the families of prisoners of war and the dead, etc., of course, at least there's going to be an exchange of prisoners, an exchange of bodies of the dead, etc. Good, it's a good thing. But in terms of even the beginning of the possibility of let's try to find.
But that could have happened, Pepe. That could have happened over a phone call. That wasn't that much.
You're absolutely right, Nima. It could have happened with a phone call and at the start of the Trump presidency. Now it's too late. And this is something all of us have been discussing openly. Now it's his war. And he doesn't know how to get rid of it because he has no strategy. Absolutely. And he thinks he can impose on the Russians from the losing side the conditions to end the war. Losers never impose conditions about ending any war. Look at history, the flow of history, in fact. And he actually believes that he can impose his deal. And then he can brag, of course, I brought, just like he brags that he brought peace between India and Pakistan. And everybody knows now that he was lying through his teeth. Same thing with the war that his superpower started against Russia using Ukraine as proxy. So can you imagine the president of the United States not only having to admit that we started the war against Russia, and now we have been strategically defeated, and we have to sign the capitulation of the Ukrainians as a co-belligerent, which is our own imperial strategic defeat. Out of the question, Nima. He cannot sell this to anybody in the West.
Oh, the humiliation.
And that's why he's in a bind. And because he cannot think strategically or start, okay, let's try to frame this another way. Let's start discussing diplomatically with the Russians. And the Russians are amenable to diplomatic discussions. You know, they have one of the best diplomatic corps on the planet. They can discuss anything, and they're open, and they listen, and they study. No, there's no American initiative. So It keeps going down and down and down all the time. And then we have a temper tantrum, like a child, like a 6-year-old saying, I'm fed up with this story of this war. I'm going to get out. Literally. This is what he said, 2 or 3 days ago.
I think, I don't know what Vladimir Putin said on phone call with, he needs to understand that this war was and has been and is Trump's war. He was escalating sanctions, weapons, everything. And right now with this new attack on nuclear bombers, it's not something, a small issue. You can say that 2 or 3 or 5 of these bombers were attacked or damaged, but the scale and the concept of this attack is hugely devastating, is hugely of concern. Of how in your opinion right now with Trump, and we know just I know that we're running out of time here, but we know that BRICS needs to understand that there is no, we had some sort of hope that the Trump administration would change the course, would change the foreign policy of the United States, but that's not happening. Right. What is the main agenda, the main objective in the upcoming summit of BRICS, in your opinion, that Russia and China and Iran would insist on, would focus on?
Well, we have a problem with this Brazilian presidency, because the priority for the Brazilians this year is not what Russia, China, and Iran are facing. Sanctioned to death, and facing, in one case, a hardcore trade war, and in 2 other cases, one ongoing war and the possibility of a war against Iran in this case. Brazil is very far away from all that. For instance, tonight we're discussing that Brazilian economy is booming at the moment. So they may not be thinking about anything else apart from, okay, we are having a lucky streak for the moment, let's ride it. And, international problems, that's too complicated, it's too far away from us, etc. This is, it's a little bit the Brazilian way of thinking, usually, So that's the problem. We're going to have these 3. These are the 3 top BRICS. India now is a joke, in fact, of their own making, by the way. So we have these 3 top BRICS involved in a serious, extremely serious conflagration with the American superpower. Mm. And the situation is very dangerous for all 3. Some have more leverage than others. Let's say Russia has more leverage than China. China has more leverage than Iran. They still have some leverage vis-a-vis the empire. That's why the empire is wobbling, because especially Trump, he doesn't know how to deal with 2 superpowers and 1 big power at the same time. It's too much for, not only it's too much for him, but it's too much for the American ruling classes. The best they can do is to name them existential threats to the United States. So how do you deal with existential threats? And we don't know. They don't. They have zillions of think tank reports, Rand Corporation, Hudson Institute, or whatever. And when you read them, it's like they were written by one person. It's one press release. More sanctions, more covert ops, more let's try to destabilize them. That's it. Nothing. And there's nothing, obviously, about diplomacy, recognizing the limits of a dwindling superpower. And okay, let's try to talk to them. We can talk about division of spheres of influence, not interfering in each other's affairs, etc. No, this is anathema for the American ruling classes, because it implies end of exceptionalism. And they only had one banner from the beginning. We are exceptional. We are better than anybody else. We are the city on the hill, all that crap, And now going down, and there's no plan B. So for them, it's a sad state of affairs, and they will become more dangerous with or without Trump. Trump is just a minor character in a much bigger picture. The big picture is how the empire is imploding. And when you have Jamie Dimon and the BlackRock guy almost in tandem saying, you look, something really big is going to happen soon, wow. It's time to be worried, right?
Exactly. Muito obrigado, Pepe. Grande.
This is a DEFCON moment for Ukraine. Air raid sirens blasting all over the country of Ukraine at this moment, warning of potential attack from Russia, launching long-range weapons in. So you see these areas here in the red? That's the areas that are currently under air raid sirens in Ukraine.
So everywhere.
So everywhere.
That's all of Ukraine, in case you don't know the map.
So that means nothing is off the table for Russia at this moment. This comes after Ukraine and NATO launched another attack on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, leaving it in critical condition of collapse. And they did it this time underwater. Here you can see the explosion under the pylons there. According to reports, Ukraine's Secret Service, along with NATO coordination, blew up the Crimean bridge. The operation took months of planning. Just like the drone strike over the weekend, underwater supports were badly damaged at the base of the bridge. You can see here, this was the previous attack on the Kerch Bridge. The bridge is now in critical condition, undrivable. NATO leader Mark Rutte says Ukraine will now join NATO. There's an irreversible path for Ukraine to join NATO, he says, which is Putin's red line, of course. Listen.
Well, you know that when it comes to Ukraine, in Washington, there was a clear commitment by all 32 allies that there is an irreversible path for Ukraine to come into NATO. Not with an end date, not understanding this as part of a peace settlement, but clearly as a longer-term commitment by all 32 allies. And we are building that bridge as we speak, with the command in Wiesbaden, with in Poland, JTEC, which is capturing all the lessons, and of course all the other cooperation ongoing between NATO countries and Ukraine. Thank you so much.
So,
and
that's
we're
clearly
saying based on a lie, given that Ukraine could not have executed the attacks it has over the last few days without the weapons and intelligence from NATO. So it's pretending that Ukraine's not already in the guest room, so to speak.
Right. And also some people say some parts of the bridge open. Of course, you remember how many months it took to secure and make sure that that bridge would be reopened. But again, these attacks that have been happening over the past few days, obviously being promulgated by neocons. You have Lindsey Graham, you have Senator Blumenthal, who just arrived, who were there in Kiev over the past few days. You can see, by the way, I don't know if you saw the hotel bill from Lindsey Graham, over $400,000 for his visit on June 1st. Isn't that unbelievable? And by the way, Lindsey Graham, so $400,000 for him to go to Ukraine, and his hotel bill, $400,000. And don't worry, though, who approved it? He did. So he approved he got approval from himself for the hotel bill so that they could meet with Zelensky, reiterate once again, doubling down on this idea that we are done negotiating with Putin. We've got to employ massive sanctions on Putin. That's why they were there, to push these new massive sanctions bill. President Trump was asked over the weekend, do you support Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill? Trump's like, I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to look at it. You haven't seen it yet? You do not support sanctions against Russia. You've been openly communicative about that. On top of that, sanctions haven't worked against Russia. They've been devastating for the West. They haven't worked at all inside of Russia. So now what else are we going to add into this mix? Massive amounts of sanctions, and also against China in this mix.
Now, look, I don't wish violence on anybody, but is it okay to wish that Lindsey Graham gets bed bugs from his travel? You can't die from that, right?
That guy is a creep. That guy is an absolute
Of the worst
creep.
order.
Yeah, and by the way,
worst.
as I pointed out over the weekend in my video, Lindsey Graham makes a boatload of money from the defense industry, a lot of money from the defense contractors, of course, who, absolutely want him to keep pushing this war
But
further.
who is he speaking on behalf of? Who is he representing? Because we have a president, we have a vice president. He only represents one state. And so on whose authority does he sign off on aggression when we have the Trump administration behind, otherwise working on peace deals, supposedly working on that in Istanbul this week? So why do we have these mixed messages? Another important question is, why does Russia tolerate this? Because they are obviously getting two messages as well. It's, on the one hand, we're going to peace deal, we want peace, we're leading you both to peace. And on the other hand, it's, well, Ukraine is using our weapons to attack you. So how would the Russians even... wouldn't there be, if you're Russian, wouldn't there be a growing movement inside Russia to please let's stop believing these jokers? We can't believe the United States. We can't believe Ukraine. There's no real peace agreement on the table, right?
No, there's no peace agreement at all. And of course, this was on the eve of these peace talks. This was on the eve of those peace talks. And of course, we don't actually have any information on that as to whether or not this is going to come together. Again, Lindsey Graham doesn't speak on behalf of the president of the United States. He's there. He's in he's in Ukraine, working nefariously behind the scenes. Steve Bannon today said that he needs to be arrested, put out an arrest warrant for Lindsey Graham, get him off the streets. Ron Paul, as a former member of Congress, wondering how in the world Senator Graham was able to go there, sort of around the backs of President Trump and any negotiators, Steve Witkoff and others, who are actually actively pushing for peace. So again, we'll be continuing to watch this story as it develops over the coming days. And it's unbelievable. We're also hearing from sources that there are reports, in fact, that President Trump did in fact know about what was coming. We don't have confirmation on that yet, but we're trying to get to the bottom of this because I think they're playing this sort of like good cop, bad cop thing right now, that sort of neocons have been doing all of this nefarious work and that the Trump administration has been completely in the dark. They didn't know this large-scale, multi-month, 18-month drone attack on Russia's nuclear infrastructure was coming? Really? You kept President Trump and his entire administration in the dark? You have CIA offices all over Ukraine, and NATO coordinated this attack? We know from multiple sources that there's no way that Ukraine carried out this attack without NATO participation, intelligence, and telemetry. Absolutely zero chance. Trump administration didn't know at all?
Well, I mean, so we are supposed to believe that after Trump and Zelensky had that falling out in the Oval Office, the Trump administration cut Ukraine off from their intelligence, and Ukraine could not fire a single bullet with any kind of accuracy. But now the Trump administration didn't know, and Ukraine was able to carry out this massive PR win on their behalf, that they somehow knew where all of Russia's bombers were. They knew how to get past Russia's security. They knew how to execute this on their own. That's very hard to believe, is it not?
Yeah. Michael Gilt in our chat, in our YouTube chat, says, I'm very disappointed in Trump's global gang right now. Yeah. And of course, you'll recall Lindsey Graham, you'll recall Senator McCain, who was there at the time, right in the middle of the Maidan Square, like filming the coup that was unfolding right before their eyes. So they're all, celebrating all of this. So we're going to have more on this story coming up
one
here.
One more piece of it, though, lest you think this has nothing to do with you. It does. And in fact, soldiers are now in Germany taking over the training of Ukrainians at the army base in Germany. It's soldiers from I can give you the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment of the Tennessee Army National Guard replaced the brigade from Pennsylvania. Yes. Our soldiers are in harm's way. Absolutely, they are, because they are training Ukrainian soldiers to do this. So do not fool yourself to think that this is at arm's length from us. It is not.
So how are Russians responding to this latest round of attacks inside of Russia, attacks inside of Moscow, attacks all over Russia, hitting the nuclear infrastructure, striking the Crimean Bridge on the eve of peace talks? Well, we thought we'd ask American journalist and author and former Senate aide Tara Reid, is an RT contributor and lives inside of Moscow and joins us now from Russia. to talk about how this is being perceived inside of Russia. Tara, great to see you. Welcome back to the show.
It's wonderful to see both of you. And, you know, this is a really unusual time in history. I mean, I was, as a geopolitical analyst, I was making predictions of peace by Easter. I was thinking that we were all moving in that direction. And then here we are having this conversation when many people are saying we're on the brink of World War III. It's shocking.
The narrative from Washington, D.C., or at least we're hearing, is that President Trump, Pete Hegseth, and others were totally in the dark, didn't know anything about what was unfolding. We understand it took 18 months of planning to carry out this large-scale drone attack against these nuclear bombers. The Crimean Bridge apparently took months of planning to attack overnight. President Trump and the defense secretary completely in the dark. But I think you're hearing something different. Well, what have you learned?
Well, I've been hearing from a couple of different people, Clayton, and I really am not wanting to spread, you know, rumors out of school, if you will. But these are reliable former intelligence and people that worked in different former administrations, presidential administrations for the DoD. They're saying that actually Pete Hegseth was with his staff watching this real time. Now, this could be a planted rumor to make Donald Trump look bad. And at this point, I wouldn't take any scenario off the table because there seems to be a real push from the neocons, particularly Lindsey Graham and others, to really put a wrench in any kind of peace talks and getting us there.
Now, if you were Russian, let's put ourselves in these shoes that American shores are under attack. Our military bases are under attack with a country that keeps telling us that they will agree to peace talks. How would we feel if our leaders said, no, we think that they're going to go to peace talks, it's going to be okay, but then American citizens were actually being killed in these attacks on bridges, on civilian infrastructure, and on our military bases? So I know how I would feel. How do Russians perceive this?
You know, Russians, it's interesting because living here in Moscow, we are hearing that there have been many in the middle of the night, up to 300 drones, right, swarming, but being shot out of the sky before they hit Moscow. South of Moscow, the most recent one was like an hour from where the center of Moscow, and they were all, they have very strong defense systems. But you were mentioning, the nuclear hangar where these planes were, and the equivalent of Montana, that would be, like Montana or South Dakota being attacked. I mean, and they say that this Operation Spiderweb, was 18 months in the making. Now, the Trump administration is denying knowledge. Obviously, if this started 18 months ago, it preceded that administration. But somebody had to know because, how do you do the communications, the satellite? They're using Starlink, which is Elon Musk's company, to communicate in Ukraine. And how Russians are feeling is, very upset. There was a bridge that now we believe at the same night that you're hearing of all these other bombings, and on this bridge, a train was derailed, and it was all civilians, including children, and 7 people died, and even more are injured. And that was believed to be a Ukrainian terrorist attack. And what the Ukrainians have been doing is attacking civilian infrastructure, which is really horrible, as well as, of course, the military structure. So Russians are upset. You had a lot of Russian people join the Russian military. And the fact is, Russia is winning this war, and they're out, maneuvering the Ukrainians 20-1. So for every, one Russian that dies, there's 20 more to replace them, so to speak. Whereas on the Ukrainian side, that's simply not the case. They're actually having to drag people off the street to constrict them. So the mood was pretty hopeful when Trump came into office with the Russian people. There were people waving, wearing MAGA hats and being, because they were thinking that maybe this would be over, this proxy war that the US and NATO are fighting against Russia, Russophobia would stop, things would normalize. but unfortunately, it seems they're escalating. So there's a quietness, like you'll notice there's a quietness in Moscow right now. And people are very somber because, it's sad. Russia does not want war. They want peace, but they did get provoked into this position because of that coup that happened in 2014 in Kiev, and then NATO and the US pushing the border up against Russia. And if this was happening in the US would be responding the same way. They would have to protect their sovereign nation.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that June 2nd, so yesterday, June 2nd, 11 years ago, is the anniversary of when Ukraine launched their first attacks against Ukraine, launched their first attacks in eastern Ukraine and hit Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and ethnic Russians and ethnic Russian forces. So 11 years ago, this, as we point out, this didn't start just a few years ago. This goes back to the coup. And so now we're sitting on the precipice of maybe Ukraine joining NATO, according to Mark Rutte today, saying that it's an irreversible path, that Ukraine will join NATO. I mean, when you talk to Russians in Moscow, I mean, are they emboldened? Are they pissed that these attacks keep happening?
They're pissed. I think they're determined this will, see through. They're trying to denazify because, as you've, brought up in many of your good reporting in the show, there are Nazis in Ukraine. And what you just pointed out about 11 years ago, there were in eastern Donbass, which is the eastern part, of Ukraine, and you had 14,000 people die in 8 years, civilians, many of them children. And it took 8 years before President Putin finally decided to do this special military operation and try to protect the people of Donbass. Now, they've all voted to be with Russia, but Kiev, Zelensky has outlawed the Russian language, has jailed political opposition, refused to have elections. So he's now the illegitimate president because there hasn't been an election. He's giving the excuse that it's wartime, but, it's wearing thin. And then, there's been a lot of war crimes as far as, human trafficking, organ, and then, of course, the biolabs. Remember, everyone seems to have forgotten about the biolabs that were U.S. sponsored, and Victoria Nuland admitted that in Congress.
Right. And so I have to imagine that Russians, and how I'm feeling, we have a lot in common because we believed that President Trump was acting in good faith to end the war in the same way we believe that Putin is acting in good faith to end the war. But now we have civilian deaths on Russian shores. And so it feels like, you don't want to go nuclear, right? Because we're a peaceful show, but it's hard to not be like, nuke this to end it, right? And so we have this frustration, this shared frustration, and I do not want that. I do not want anyone.
This is a surprising turn of events.
No, it's hard to not feel that way. That's not how I feel.
Well, I was asking that about the Russians, like how, they keep being attacked. They keep being attacked. How much patience do they have for this?
Both of us. This is what I'm saying: is that our patience on both sides with President Trump and President Putin has to be wearing thin. There's no other option for us as the populace of those leaders.
You make a good point, and you're bringing up the nuclear doctrine that President Putin just amended in 2024. So that's just last year. And part of that amendment was recognizing that any non-nuclear state that's being supported by a nuclear state could give a cause for a response, a nuclear response. So legally, because of what happened in that hangar, whether, there were 4 planes, or Ukraine claims there was 40, but Russia says there were 4 planes that were bombed, essentially. And what are we doing bombing, these planes and hangars anyway? How dangerous is that? But it does trigger that nuclear doctrine if President Putin chose to use it. Now, President Putin is very level-headed. He's very calm. He's going to do what's best for the Russian people. He's, and you have Starmer, in England and UK, who's claiming that they're ready for war or whatever, which they're not. They don't have an army that could properly even stand up to Russia. Russia has a huge...
No, they couldn't even beat the Houthis. Like,
no.
come on.
No.
Stop it.
Yeah. So this is, but I wanted to bring up Lindsey Graham because a day before these bombings happened, and there were several, there was the bridge the same day as the hangar, as as I woke up in the middle of the night to reports that there was like 300 drones that were shot down that were coming towards Moscow, things like that. So, these are very serious times, right? Well, guess who was here 2 days, 48 hours before in Kiev, who's there, was Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal. Now, they somehow worked up a hotel bill in one night for the taxpayers of $800,000. There's a receipt for that. So I don't know what they ordered for room service, but quite a bill. And in that one night in Kiev, they had these talks. And then, 2 days later, you had all these bombings. And then you have Lindsey Graham kind of going rogue, saying that he's going to sponsor more severe sanctions against Russia and siding with Ukraine, which is, now that's triggering the Logan Act. And the Logan Act means that what he's engaging in is sedition.
Right.
Yeah. So senators negotiating with a foreign country without the consent of the United States president. So what was he doing there? As Ron Paul pointed out this morning, like, this is a clear violation. Steve Bannon called for him to be arrested, Lindsey Graham to be arrested.
Absolutely, he could be. I mean, if President Trump wanted to, he could call him into the office because he conspired with other senators and arrest him under the Logan Act because it's seditious. He needs to follow, because it's up to the president to establish the foreign policy. Now, the Senate can advise, they can recommend, they can make a big letter and say, hey, we really don't want you to do this. And any president of the United States would look at that and there would be a debate or a discussion. But in this case, Lindsey Graham has gone rogue, in my opinion.
Craig William in our chat says there are Republicans in South Carolina voting for Lindsey Graham. I want to have a talk with you. If you ever cast your vote for Lindsey Graham, I need to talk to you. You are working against the rest of us.
You probably
don't understand. You must love war.
Well, you probably work for Boeing in his backyard, or one of the defense contractor companies in his backyard.
Do you remember what Lindsey Graham said? I think it was last year. He said, this war, this proxy war, is the best money we ever spent killing Russians. Yeah. And he made that really inflammatory statement. I mean, when I worked in the Senate, he was at the South Carolina House of Representatives that year. And then he went on to go on into the House before he went to the Senate. I think he was in the Senate later in 2003. But I knew of him because he was such good friends of John McCain, and he was at some sort of event. He's always been blustery. He's always been unusual and belligerent, especially about war. And, he doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have any children. I don't think Lindsey Graham cares if we go to nuclear war. I really don't. He's somehow, with his $100,000 a year salary, made multi-millions. I don't know how that is. But I would have loved it if Musk would have investigated him.
Oh, I would have loved if we actually look at this $400,000 hotel bill from him, and then the other $400,000 from Blumenthal. How are you spending $400,000 at a hotel? But don't worry, Lindsey Graham says he authorized it himself, so nothing to see here, nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
Next time I travel, I'll authorize it myself.
Yeah, a fox in the hen house. That's what that is.
Exactly. All right. Well, Tara Reid, thank you for staying up till 1 a.m. in Moscow.
It's 11:30 there, isn't it? In Moscow?
It's 11:30 actually.
Oh, 11:30. Oh, sorry, my
sounds better.
World time buddy was off. Okay. You can read her book, Left Out: When the Truth Doesn't Fit In, how she was a Democratic aide who left the Democratic Party because her story did not fit the narrative. Thank you so much. Also follow her at Reid Alexandra. Yes, Reid Alexandra. That's correct. Thank you for offering to come on.
you. Call 800-511. And how significant a military, from a military perspective, Colonel, how significant was this attack? We're hearing stories that it was 40 to 50 planes that were destroyed, and we're hearing stories that it was 4 to 7 planes that were destroyed.
I think for the most part, it was a PR stunt to try and convey the impression that Ukraine is capable of carrying on the war, has great fight left in it, and is capable ultimately of harming Russia. I don't think the harm was very great. I think it's grossly exaggerated in the West. Anything you hear from the Western outlets, BBC, or any of the mainstream in the United States are probably untrue, or at least grossly exaggerated. What I think is true is that we damaged ourselves and our relationship, what there is left of it, with Moscow by attacking these bombers on the tarmac or the runway as a result of the strategic arms limitation agreements. And I think the Russians have reached the point now where collectively they all say we can't be trusted. Whatever we say is irrelevant because it's probably untrue. So I think that's the real fallout from this. We lost whatever lingering credibility we may have had with them for the foreseeable future.
Well, you went right to where I was going to ask you about next. I mean, there are complaints this morning that President Zelensky did not tell President Trump, but surely senior officials in the CIA or the DIA, whichever intel group was involved in planning and carrying this out, must have known about it. Is it true that it took 18 months to plan and plot, the first year under the Biden folks and the final 6 months under Trump?
You know, that's something I can't evaluate. I don't know. It may well be the case. Remember that Russia is an enormous country with thousands of miles of border. It's not hard to penetrate. And this was clearly an interesting and innovative way to attack by using these trucks that with roofs that could be opened and then launch these drones. But we've seen this sort of thing before. The Russians have actually used containers on merchant ships to carry missiles that could be launched. I think there was something of a strategic failure on the intelligence side inside Russia. I don't know how that will be handled, but I'm sure that someone or some people will be held accountable for that.
General Keane, who of course works for a think tank that is a friend for either the Defense Department or for Langley, is calling it a tremendous victory for the Ukrainians and a catastrophic defeat. This on Fox News where he works, and a catastrophic defeat for the Russians, claiming that the Ukrainians had engaged Russian drivers and Russian engineers, and all of this was assembled in Russia, and it's a catastrophic failure on the part of Russian intel. You think there's a little CIA exaggeration there?
No, I think so. I think the larger issue is not these sort of outrageous, nonsensical claims that are being made. And, you know, General Keene's an intelligent man. He knows the truth, but he's on the payroll and he's rewarded richly in New York City as well as in Washington, D.C. and the defense industries for pushing the conflict. You know, we like to say that the so-called Democrats are all about refugees and open borders, and the so-called Republicans are all about endless war. In truth, they all fit together as one party, and General Keane is serving that interest. I think the larger question, though, is as follows. What is the likely impact of all of this on Russia? How are the Russians going to proceed from here? There are a lot of really angry people in Russia, Judge. I'm not talking about just officials. I'm talking about the population. And they have always been dissatisfied with the slow, ponderous, deliberate progress that the Russian armed forces have made in eastern Ukraine. And I think that this also reinforces in the minds of the delusional in Washington that how can the Russians pose any real threat to us? Look how long it's taken them to advance in eastern Ukraine. No understanding of the larger goals, no understanding of the larger objectives, one of which is to avoid war with us and NATO. The problem now for President Putin and his generals is you can't put up with this any longer. You've got to really push this to some sort of conclusion, or you risk this whole business escalating out of control because you don't know who you're dealing with. President Trump tweets things or sends out things on X, and he thinks because he says them, they're true. This is not my war. I didn't start this. I don't want it. Well, that's interesting, but it's irrelevant, President Trump. This is your war. You are the commander in chief. This is your responsibility. And that's the way the Russians look at it and everybody else. And he's beginning to look either feckless or downright reckless.
What do you think the pressure is like on President Putin to respond dramatically? He has the Oreshniks. He has, God forbid, he uses them, nuclear weapons. I get it that Russians are angry. These are Russians in the street. These are Russian elites. These are Russians in the intelligence community. These are Russians in the upper ranks of the military. And these are Russians that advise him every day.
President Trupin, what am I saying? Trupin, that's a new one. President Putin, if anything, is not emotional. That doesn't mean he doesn't feel anything, but he's a man who learned early on how to manage and control his emotions. No doubt he shares the anger of his population. Absolutely. But he's not a Trump-like figure. This is not someone who beats his chest in public and is anxious to announce his immediate intentions. I think what is happening right now is that they have an enormous number, over 700,000 troops in Ukraine right now. They have additional forces in Belarus and inside the Russian borders. What he's doing at this point is he's looking at the map, he's listening to his commanders, and he is concluding that they have to press west. In other words, to Dnipro, which is on the Dnieper River, also to Kherson, and then ultimately down into Odessa. I think, if anything, these events, these PR stunts with explosives, either in Siberia on these airfields or with the bridge to Crimea, which, contrary to popular belief, is no longer as vital and essential as it once was, but it's still symbolic. Nevertheless, I think he's reached the point now where he understands they're going to have to press to those areas. And I think that will be his response. He's not going to announce it in a big way, but over the next week or two, I think you're going to see major troop movements. And there's not a damn thing that the Ukrainians can do about it.
Does the nature of this attack, with the drones being smuggled into Russia and set off from within Russia, bear the earmarks of Mossad? Does it remind you of the exploding pagers?
Well, keep in mind that there are many Mossad agents inside Ukraine. They've been involved for some time now. Reports came in early on within the first couple of years of Mossad officers who spoke perfect Ukrainian, fluent Ukrainian, in Ukrainian uniform, directing operations, running replacement operations, and so forth. So they've been involved from the beginning. And keep in mind that the CIA, and MI6 in Great Britain and Mossad are all joined at the hip. After all, their cooperation made possible the removal of Assad. Obviously, the Turkish president Erdogan had the critical role to play because he had most of the power in Syria. But nevertheless, they were instrumental, and now they're instrumental in integrating the former ISIS and Al-Qaeda elements into this new permanent Syrian army. So they're all over. They're involved. If you begin asking, well, how much were they involved? Then we're in the game of speculation.
Right.
I have no idea, but they're involved.
But is it understood from your perspective that CIA, MI6, Mossad, and I forget the initials, forgive me, the Ukrainian intel work together?
Yes, SBU, which is or the initials that you're talking about, they're very definitely not just integrated, they're heavily dependent upon it. I mean, again, who's going to provide them with the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities and the resulting intelligence that flows from that? Well, we're the principal source.
This is the problem with President Trump standing up there and saying, I don't want this, and I've tried to end it, and I don't want any part of this. Well, that's fine, Mr. President, but you're ultimately responsible for all of it now. And no one is going to believe anything you say unless you act decisively to disengage from this. And thus far, we found out that President Trump isn't willing to do anything to fundamentally change what Biden and his administration did.
I'm just wondering now, if the CIA's involvement was integral, wouldn't they have had an obligation to, under the law, get a presidential finding before they could do this? Stated differently, did Donald Trump know about this ahead of time?
Well, in theory, you're right. And there may be a finding left over from the previous president that they'll refer to. As far as President Trump is concerned, this is not someone who is detail oriented. This is not someone who sits down and studies reports. This is not someone who sits through lengthy briefings and asks hard questions. We had this recent incident where 4 American soldiers were returned. Their remains were returned to the United States from Lithuania. The Lithuanians provided them with almost a state funeral. They arrived at Dover Air Force Base, and there was no president of the United States to greet them. Now, technically, he doesn't have to be there. And he sent Mr. Hegseth, the current Secretary of Defense, to go receive these. But people remember vividly Ronald Reagan receiving these bodies after the Beirut bombing. That has been imprinted on the American mind like nothing else. And there was an expectation that the loss of these men's lives would be noted publicly by the president in a dramatic way. It didn't happen. Instead, he went to a golfing tournament sponsored by the Saudis. I don't think there's a lot of self-awareness with President Trump. I don't think he grasps the dangers that are involved. And so the only thing I can tell you is that he may well not have known, and he may have simply waved it off and said, yeah, that's fine, whatever, and gone on with the rest of his day. That sounds callous, but I don't think it's unrealistic.
And I wonder what happens when he and President Putin speak again. Hey, Donald, your guys tried to destroy a good chunk of my military, and you didn't know about it? Come on.
I think President Putin will be, as always, polite, but pay absolutely no attention to anything President Trump says. Remember, President I'm trying to turn Putin into Trupin again. Yeah. President Putin has said on more than one occasion that he's dealt with several presidents, Judge.
Right.
He discovered that it really didn't make a great deal of difference what they said or what they insisted were their intentions, that ultimately there was another power in Washington. And that power was making the decisions. And so the presidents themselves didn't turn out to be very influential. In Russia, the president of Russia has enormous power and authority. And if he says something, it happens. If he says it's not going to happen, it won't. So for the Russians right now, this whole business is hard to grasp. And they'll continue to be polite because that's their nature. But they're going to press on and do whatever they think they have to secure their borders and their country.
Let me switch gears, if I might. You mentioned Secretary Hegseth. I think he's been, you may disagree with me, saber rattling over China lately. Is something happening over there, or is this just a diversion?
First of all, the U.S. armed forces are in no shape to take on any major power in a major war. So the whole notion that we're going to threaten the Chinese or the Russians or someone else into obedience, which is what Mr. Hegseth and President Trump seem to think is deterrence. In other words, the notion that we can bully people into submission is nonsense. And that's a big problem right now, because I know that President Trump thinks that bullying works. Well, it may work on the Panamanians. I don't know. It may work on, people in Central Africa, but it's not going to work in Asia. It's not going to work in Europe. Certainly not going to work anymore in the Middle East. So I think that's part of the problem. The second thing is, this is absurd. If you stop and look at it on its face, we've done everything in our power with these tariffs, not only to try and harm China, Russia, and Iran and other states. We've harmed our allies, our friends, people who are friendly to us. we have made a mess of the world right now. And there have been meetings all over the world. And the media doesn't report this stuff. You can go to Asia. They've had these meetings in Singapore and other capitals. And they're saying, what do we do with patient zero? You understand patient zero? Patient zero is the man with the original malady that can infect everybody and kill them.
Right.
That's the way they refer to President Trump at this point.
Oh, boy.
So the objective is to contain the Americans. You know, this is a rogue state that still has enough military power at its disposal to do a lot of damage. So what we have to do collectively, all around the world, this is what BRICS is all about. It's not just militarily, but it's also financial and economic. How do we protect ourselves against this? How do we contain the bacillus? That's the way we're viewed at the moment. So I think President Trump is out of touch with reality. I don't think people are telling him the truth. And who knows, it may not make any difference, because no matter how much damage these things do, the tariffs or the threat of dramatically increasing them, right now he wants to tax foreign capital. Well, the most dangerous thing he can do at this point is drive foreign capital out of the United States.
Right.
We need foreign capital. We shouldn't be taxing any of it. This should be a haven for it. And so people are looking at this, whether you're in the Emirates or Singapore or China or Japan or Korea or anywhere else, you're saying, well, we got to get our money out. And the stupidity that you hear in Washington from everybody is, well, there's nowhere else for them to go. We're the biggest market in the world. Well, they're out of their minds.
Not true. Yeah.
That's just nonsense. So you can't view what's being done militarily, which is stupid and counterproductive, as something separate and distinct from what's happening on the financial and economic side. It's all linked, and it's all bad at this point.
Let me switch gears, if I could, to another bad state of affairs. What is your understanding of resistance movements over the genocide in Gaza and the persistent refusal of the Israeli government to allow sufficient food and medical supplies into Gaza?
Remember, the most important thing to Mr. Netanyahu and to the Israeli state is our unconditional support for whatever he wants to do. That's the bottom line. We can't lose sight of that. As long as we are 100% on board, as long as we are going to continue to supply the Israelis with whatever they need to destroy the populations in Gaza and the West Bank, to pulverize southern Lebanon, places in Syria, or potentially even Egypt or anywhere else in the region, it doesn't matter to them what anybody else thinks. Now, because we have a media that is very obedient, not just on the Ukraine narrative, which is utterly and completely false, but also obedient to the Gaza and West Bank narratives, that this Project Greater Israel is justified and rooted in everything from biblical texts to, modern day anti-Semitism. This sort of thing is just it's unsustainable from the standpoint of most of the world. Even the British now, who have very much been in the Israeli pocket, have now stepped forward and said this is unacceptable. The French, even the Germans, who have spent 80 years apologizing and subsidizing Israel, have said, no, we can't go on with this. So the rest of the world has turned, I would argue, overwhelmingly against Israel. And it doesn't make any difference, Judge.
Does it make a difference that Arab nations might do something? Are there movements in Egypt to challenge Netanyahu?
Well, you have this march on Gaza that people are trying to organize in Egypt, where they hope they can get hundreds of thousands of people to walk across the Sinai towards Gaza to the Rafah gate and demand that it be open and people there be fed and so forth. If you're an Israeli, given their mentality and what they're doing and the military power at their disposal right now that they can use with impunity, that's laughable. Nobody cares. They could care less. Go ahead, march across the Sinai. If you're going to deal with Israel, I think everyone in the world has discovered there's only one way to deal with them, and that is the way they deal with everybody else. The problem with that at this point is us. Everyone is prepared to go after Israel. Let's not kid ourselves at this point. The Israelis have made themselves about as popular as the plague. But as long as we stand with the Israelis, people are going to shy away from that. Now, how long will that last? We don't know. We just don't know. But we know that the Israelis are in charge, and the rest of the world knows that. We have not only no strategy, no plan, no attainable objectives that conform to what we would call the American strategic interest. That doesn't exist. Everything's impulse with President Trump from day to day. But his impulses are not even that important. What's important is that if you sit down, you're president of the United States, you say, how many senators or congressmen do I have to pass this particular legislation? And you find out that President Netanyahu or Prime Minister Netanyahu controls more senators and more congressmen than the president does. Well, I think that about sums it up. Wow. And right now, that's the fact. So, you know, President Trump can bloviate, he can complain, but nothing is really going to change on that score. And by the way, it's very interesting that if you look at this big, new, beautiful bill that the president was talking about, which Elon Musk has rightly characterized as a catastrophe for the nation, one of the things that's really interesting is that President Trump reserves all of his anger and spleen for really two people. One is Senator Rand Paul in Kentucky, and the other is Thomas Massie from Kentucky. So I imagine the anti-Semitic task force will descend on Kentucky in the near future and begin mass arrests. Well, I'm just kidding, obviously.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand exactly what you mean. I appreciate that analysis. Would hundreds of thousands of Egyptians marching across the Sinai put pressure on General al-Sisi or not?
Only to provide sufficient water and transportation and medical support to avoid large numbers of people dying. Otherwise, I would say in the immediate sense, no. The army is already anxious to fight. That is the Egyptian force. The nation is anxious to fight. General Sisi, as I've tried to say earlier, doesn't want a fight that will involve us. I mean, his nightmare is if I attack the Israelis for what they're doing in Gaza, all sorts of terrible things could happen to us in Egypt. And we have no means of protecting ourselves against an American military offensive action against us. Now, he's had conversations with Mr. Erdogan. He's had long and detailed conversations and discussions with Tehran. He talks at great length with MBS in Saudi Arabia. So he's preparing for the worst case scenario. I think in his mind, eventually a war is coming and he's going to have to deal with it. He won't be able to avoid it, but he's not going to act prematurely to bring it on. And again, the thing that we don't have, and I think Ambassador Freeman has been on to talk about this and others, we have an acute lack of executive competence. When you look at the people that have been picked for the administration to do things, these aren't experienced, thoughtful people. They are not supported by large numbers of old hands, people that know what they're doing. I'm not saying that the last administration was better. They weren't. They set the tone and the stage for everything that's happening now. The great tragedy is very little has changed since President Trump took power. But President Trump is focused on optics. It's back to what I said before about X. Sends out a statement on X and he says, "This is not my war. I don't like it." He thinks that now is concrete, that something emerges from it. I don't think he understands that saying these things and getting something done and moving something in a different direction are very different. So there is no executive competence with this administration. So I don't know what happens. And I think that's why we're increasingly treated as patient zero. Everybody is equally alarmed, but also confused.
Thank you for all this, Colonel. Thank you for your analysis on all of these issues. As unpleasant as it is, you are a breath of fresh air because of your ability to bore in and get through the PR fog. Thank you again, my dear friend.
2 Chinese nationals have been charged with smuggling a dangerous biological pathogen into the United States. And this pathogen is considered a serious threat to our food supply and thus our national security. Fox's David Spunt is here with all the details. David, this is terrifying.
Laura, it really is quite an interesting story. According to the Justice Department, one of them worked at a laboratory connected to the University of Michigan. The FBI arrested 33-year-old Yu Qing Zhan for allegedly smuggling in a fungus called Fusarium graminearum, which could be used as an agroterrorism weapon. The gases from the fungus could cause liver damage, vomiting, and reproductive defects in humans and livestock. DOJ officials say Zhan has direct ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and she works at the University of Michigan, and her boyfriend is connected to a university back in China. FBI Director Kash Patel, in an exclusive statement to Fox Digital, says this case is a sobering reminder that the Chinese Communist Party continues to deploy operatives and researchers to infiltrate our institutions and target our food supply, an act that could cripple our economy and endanger American lives. Smuggling a known agroterrorism agent into the U.S. is not just a violation of law, it's a direct threat to national security. I commend the FBI Detroit Division and our partners at CPB for stopping this biological threat before it could do real damage. Now, senior DOJ leaders, Laura, are debating whether to bring back the so-called China Initiative, a controversial program during the Bill Barr Justice Department that aimed to stop Chinese espionage that began in American universities. The DOJ under Merrick Garland got rid of the name after groups came forward and complained it was insensitive, but I'm told the current Attorney General Pam Bondi and her team want to focus on China, though it's unclear if they'll bring the China Initiative name back.
So once again, we have another threat from China here against the country. We have them in the electrical systems, we have them in the water systems, all per Christopher Wray, and now they're saying a direct threat to the food supply. These are 2 people they say that they arrested, but how many have gone unarrested, unchecked? We know there's about 1 million that have slipped across the border, and they're staying on property owned by the Chinese right next to our bases. No one wants to say a word about it. It seems pretty obvious. Whatever big event we're coming up on here, it's going to be blamed on China, because they're all over the place and no one's doing a thing to get them out. Join me on the live streams where I talk about this in greater detail Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Coffee. Follow me.